Hello, thank you for joining us. This is Guiding Native Farmers Through COVID-19 Relief and Recovery. It's co-hosted by Native American Agriculture Fund, Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, Farm Aid, and Farmers Legal Action Group. We're really happy to be able to come to you, not happy about the situation. Well, we know that each of you are dealing with your own unique circumstances, even as we attempt and succeed in weathering this global pandemic. We thank you for taking this time to join us, and we hope that this information will be useful and productive for you. We just want to acknowledge that everyone is under immense stress in this time. And we know that things are tough and may be tough for different reasons. Perhaps you're dealing with a loss of markets. Perhaps you're dealing with trying to cater to demand that you've never experienced before. And all of you are so in tune to the needs of your community, and you're going above and beyond to make sure that people have food that they need each day. And so we thank you for your efforts. We thank you for the generations of your families who have done the same things. And we just want to provide a little bit of hope that says that as Native people, we have been through things and we're resilient, and that we'll come out on the other side of this. And hopefully we can come out stronger by building bonds among us. So thank you for joining. Next, I would like to introduce the panelists today who are going to walk you through these resources in no particular order because they're all fantastic. We have Janie Hipp, CEO of Native American Agriculture Fund. We have Colby Duran, a leader of the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. We have two folks from Farmers Legal Action Group, Stephen Carpenter and Lindsay Kuhn. And we have Alicia Harvey from Farm Aid. And with that, I'd like to pass it off to Alicia for her to walk us through the beginning of this.
Thank you so much. Really grateful and glad to be here with everybody. Just want to start this conversation with just a little bit of framing. Farm Aid started in the midst of the 1980s farm crisis. And what we know from our 35 years of experience now is that moments of disasters and emergencies bring existential threats to farms and ranches. They are existential moments for the whole sector. And I think what we most want to stress the importance of is how powerful everyone on this call can be in providing accurate information to farmers, but also in creating a community that learns together and exchanges information about what we're seeing on the ground. I think especially in a moment of more chaos, new programs, new things unrolling, and in general, pitfalls we know that tend to happen during crisis moments. This community becomes very important for shifting our understanding of how we save individual farms into how we can actually make a dent in what's going on sector-wide. And so we at Farm Aid have called this sort of farm advocacy and the work of connecting those dots between individual one-on-one work with farmers to broad systemic change. And so that's some of the frame that we're bringing to the conversation broadly. And with that, I'll pass it over to Janie.
Thanks, Alicia. I had to unmute myself, sorry. I won't take very long this afternoon other than to thank Farm Aid and thank FLAG and thank Colby at IFAI for taking part in this today. Some of you may not know that many years ago when I started my career back in the 80s, one of the very first trainings that I ever went to on farm and ranch advocacy was actually held by FLAG, by the group that Stephen and Lindsay have been a part of for a really long time. So, you know, in my early years in the 80s, I learned from these folks, literally. Maybe not Lindsay, because she's younger than me, but I think, Stephen, you may have been in the room. But the resources that they can bring to bear to literally try to unpack issues and unpack processes that will help individual farmers and ranchers, whoever owns and manages a farm, are really invaluable. They've been invaluable to me in the course of my career, and they've been invaluable to a lot of farmers and ranchers across the country. I found out that they were Keeps Eagle Fast Track grantees. And that was a very important, I think, investment by the group of folks who decided who was going to be funded as fast track grantees. And so while many of you on the call may not have had work with them, over the years like I have, I hope that you will join me in welcoming them into our space and understanding that they have a lot of knowledge and depth in these issues that we can learn from and that they can share with us. So I also want to let everybody know that most of what we're going to be talking about today is really not focused on the relief and resources that are coming to tribal governments. We literally are trying to go deep into the space of how farmers and ranchers can access the relief pieces that are coming out. And believe me, they're coming out in a very weird way, a very confusing way. They're involving agencies that we don't normally work with. And so it's a lot to keep up with, but just know that NAAF is going to keep in connection with FLAG and Farm Aid and IFAI, IAC, all of those folks who have boots on the ground, literally, and that we will keep adding resources to our website so that people can keep up, because we're going to be trying to keep up as well. So I'm going to turn it over to everybody else now, but occasionally you will hear me pipe in, but I just wanted to thank everybody for taking part in today. I know that many of you are farmers, ranchers, some of you are CDFI leaders, some of you are tribal government reps. We got a little bit of everybody. We've even got some tribal colleges in the mix, and we've got some nonprofits in the mix. So all of those eligible entities that work with and through NAAF, we see represented on our participant list today. So let's keep this going, and let's keep communicating with each other, because as we move through this together, Alicia's right, we got to keep talking with each other, because that is what gets information into the hands of the farmers and ranchers. So with that, I'll leave it to everybody else. Let's get going.
Also had to unmute. Hi, I'm Stephen from Farmers Legal Action Group here with Lindsay. It's really an honor to join you folks. Really quite an honor. So what I want to do for just a couple of minutes is describe the Farmer's Guide to COVID-19 Relief. If you have the little agenda in front of you, there's a link to it. And it's sort of the background of the work that we're talking about. And so essentially what happens is that at FLAG, we're a nonprofit law firm that works on behalf of family farmers. This crisis hit, and so we decided to try to explain what the programs being created actually did for people who were farming and ranching. And it turned out to be more complicated than we even really expected. We've got a major crisis. We've got a lot of programs coming forward. They've been created very quickly. Sometimes you think, geez, could they have made this a little clearer? And then other times you think, well, I'm glad I don't have to try to do all this in 5 minutes as well. So what we tried to do was write about all the programs. Some of them are very familiar to us. Some are super unfamiliar. Weird agencies we're not used to dealing with, lots of money. The rules are pretty unclear, lots of agencies, and in many cases, as we will hear, a very short timeline. So while we hoped that you can get some good information here in this hour and a half, what we really want to point you to is the guide. It's free, download it, distribute it, use it any way that you care to. I guess maybe don't sell it. Other than that, go for it. But it provides the details, the really lengthy, dry details of all the programs that we're discussing. So you don't have to memorize the things that we're trying to say. We wrote it with the idea that it would be comprehensive, it would cover all the programs, but also that it would be something that everyday folks could read and use. And that was one of our goals. We also were hoping that it could be help not only individual farmers and ranchers, but also be useful if people were trying to do some policy work about maybe reshaping these programs and how they worked. As you're going to hear, some of the things were passed by Congress and would take congressional actions, some were not. And so we tried to highlight that in our materials. You may also be interested in a really short version of this, which we're about to release and get out there, 3 to 4 pages, really, really boiled down. And we hope that will be useful too. We're going to be available for questions, of course. We're very easy to get a hold of. Send us an email if you have a question about the book. I know that Janie also would love to hear from you. If you have a particular question, ask Lindsay or me through email, call us, whatever it takes to sort of make things as clear as possible and as useful as possible. So with that, we're going to go through these programs and try to make a little bit of sense of it all. Next up, go for it, Lindsay.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Lindsay. I work with Stephen as FLAG, as he mentioned, and I'm very grateful to be here today with you all. I'm going to start us off. I think a lot of the impetus for the guide and a lot of what we're talking about today came out of legislation that was passed at the end of March called the CARES Act, which I imagine most of you are familiar with. And that act rolled out a lot of different programs, and some of what was rolled out in that was money specific to the USDA. And that's what I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes talking about. So in the CARES Act, there was $14 billion set aside for the CCC, the Commodity Credit Corporation, and then another $9.5 billion that was to go directly to USDA. And so since the act was passed, what has happened, USDA has begun to explain, what they're going to do with that money, and more specifically, I suppose. And so they have developed what is called the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, or CFAP. And Colby and I are going to talk just a little about this. CFAP has two main components. And the first, there is $16 billion that is going as direct payments to farmers. And so this is money that is going to be spent for actual losses by farmers and ranchers, and that can be due to price or supply chain changes as a direct response to COVID-19. The money can also be used as payments for lost demand or an oversupply. To date, we don't know too many specifics about how those payments will be paid out and what farmers and ranchers will need to show in order to receive that money. But what we can say is that because it's based on actual losses, we expect that there will be a need to demonstrate those losses in some form. So that was the first pot of money in the CFAP program. Again, the direct payments to farmers, $16 billion. And the second pot of money is $3 billion that's being spent on what is known as the Farmers to Families Food Box Program. And I believe Colby is going to give a bit more detail on that, so I will pass it over to him now.
Thank you very much, Lindsay, and thank you very much to Farm Aid, FLAG, and to NAAF for all your work in putting together this webinar. Honored to be on it with you all. As Lindsay talked about, the second half of the CFAP program is what USDA has called the Farmers to Family Food Box Program. And so they've allocated about $3 billion worth of money to do purchases, and that's going to break down about $100 million per month in fresh fruits and vegetables, $100 million in a variety of dairy products, and $100 million per month in meat products. And a lot of the specific information regarding this is on AMS's website. One thing to mention, I think in particular, that says as this has kind of moved fast, a lot of things have moved fast. The RFP for this was, I think, put in about a week plus ago, and was already due by the middle of the day last Friday. So this process is closed. We've asked AMS if they will be doing and accepting more RFPs on a rolling basis, and the answer we got back was that they've reserved the right to, but they don't have one currently available. So what this program will do is to kind of partner with local and regional distributors to purchase food from from farmers and ranchers, package the food up, and then work with either an entity on the ground, which can be a nonprofit, a tribal government, or other entity that fits within those some of those types of categories to distribute the food out. There have been, I know, particularly from the tribal side, some concerns that have been brought up about this program. We worked with a couple of tribal governments and tribal enterprises last week to see if they could get into this program. And that includes a particular tribal enterprise that is a USDA certified vendor, also one that does food distribution and does large scale government contracting worldwide in all different venues of it. And they looked at the application and didn't think that they actually qualified for it, or that they would have some challenges with some of the AMS requirements regarding past performance. So those issues have been raised, and we know that the department is starting to look at that to ensure that these types of programs, as they're either being developed or in the next pieces of legislation, I think Stephen mentioned that there are additional programs and components that come from Congress, will be inclusive of not only tribes, but also inclusive of tribal producers to ensure that they have market protections on there as well too. And we're kind of building out some of the other different parts of the agriculture supply chain and ensuring they have support at this time. I think with that, turn it over to the next presenter.
So there's one thing that we wanted to add quickly about the USDA programs, and that is that the way that they seem to be thinking about it is that they're going to send checks to individual farmers and ranchers. One thing to remember is that there's going to be paperwork involved with some of this, which we'll talk a little bit about as we go forward when we talk about other sort of paperwork problems. The other thing that we just wanted to say right off is one of the most common questions we've been getting is, well, if I participate in this USDA program, does that mean I can't participate in some other program, Small Business Administration, whatever else? And as far as we can tell, the answer to that is no. Sometimes you do have these agency programs where they think there's double dipping going on. So if you do one, you can't do the other. We see no sign of that, but it's something that we hope to really keep track of. And as we revise our guide, which we've already done once and will continue to do, it's something that we will track. So with that, why don't we move on to what on your little list here is number 4. That's the individual recovery rebates. Some people are calling these economic injury payments. There's always a fancy name when the government writes a check. This is the sort of well-known Treasury Department payments that are going out to people. There's been a lot written about it. I think, you know, all things considered, the Treasury Department's website is actually pretty good. If you have a question, we know that there are people having problems getting their payments. And the one thing that we wanted to remind folks with an eye toward farmers and ranchers is that if you have a lender or other creditor out there who has a lien or perhaps a judgment and is able to go after your bank account, these payments are vulnerable to that. So they can land up in your bank account and disappear because a creditor can take them. You know, the government is saying they won't do it, but other creditors are perfectly able and in some cases willing to do that. So with that in mind, why don't we move on to what is perhaps the most unfamiliar, the biggest, and the most complicated program. That's the Small Business Administration efforts. And therefore, we turn it over to Lindsay.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, so the SBA programs, there are 2 main ones that were rolled out in the CARES Act, and by all accounts, it has been pretty confusing and chaotic for many of us trying to understand them. The 2 programs I'm talking about, the first is the Paycheck Protection Program, or the PPP, and the second is the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, or EIDL. And I want to say upfront that both are available to farmers now. That is a change that I'll describe a little later. But also, I want everyone to keep in mind that although these are both broadly under the SBA, they are different programs with different pots of money, different eligibility requirements, and different ways that you can go about applying. So that's something to keep in mind. But what in part has been so confusing about understanding these programs is that there's not only been the initial funding that came out with the CARES Act, and that funding again came out the end of March. By the middle of April, that funding was gone. So these programs essentially had no more money in them. Then towards the end of April, another law was passed that refunded both of the programs, and then provided some other changes that we'll talk about. But those two waves of funding have led to some confusion because there are people who are still in the pipeline from April for under the CARES Act, and so that has led to some confusion. And also, you know, although the Act kind of allocated a certain amount of money, it didn't provide a lot of rules for how the money would be distributed and what the eligibility specifics were. So what's happened since the Act came out is we've had various rules that have come out, and they've been somewhat sporadic, and they don't address all of the questions that we have. So there is a lot of confusion, and I think my goal in the next few minutes is just to give you a broad overview of what we do know, because we do have a foundation to go from, and although there will probably still be questions, I think it's important to know what the law says and what the existing rules say. And I think Janie and Colby will kind of jump in when they see fit to sort of apply this specifically to Native farmers and ranchers if there are extra things to know. So with that, I'm going to start describing the Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP. And again, this came out with the CARES Act. It was a completely new program, so we had not heard of this before. And at that time, there was $349 billion allocated towards it. And the overall goal of the PPP is to provide loans to small businesses, which can include farms and ranches, and for people who are self-employed or independent contractors. But it's to provide loans to help businesses retain their employees for roughly 8 weeks of payroll expenses. So another important aspect of this program is that those loans can be completely forgiven if all of the rules are followed. So then the question becomes, what are the rules? So with the PPP, any money that a farmer or rancher or small business receives, there's certain requirements on what you can use that money for. So as I mentioned, because this really is about payroll, at least 75% of the funds have to be used for your payroll expenses. And so that, generally speaking, is the wages you're paying employees or yourselves, and in some cases, certain benefits such as medical benefits. So 75% needs to be used for that, but the money can also be used for things like utilities, rent, and mortgage interest payments. And one key thing I want to state is that, you know, even if you were to receive money, and let's say you didn't use all of it for the reasons that are allowed, what then happens is this turns into more of a traditional loan in the sense that there is a 1% interest rate, and you have 2 years to pay back any portion that the government won't forgive. So that's kind of broadly how it works. The question for most of you who are viewing it today is probably, well, how does this work for farmers and ranchers? And so towards the end of April, there was some guidance that came out specifically for self-employed individuals, you know, which can include sole proprietorships or independent contractors, and trying to answer the question of, well, how do you apply for this program if you're self-employed? And the rules that came out established 4 eligibility criteria. So, and again, this would apply equally to any farmer or rancher who is self-employed. So the first requirement is that you have to have been in business on February 15th of this year. So if you are a really new farmer ranch, you know, you may have trouble accessing the PPP money. The second requirement is that you need to have some self-employment income. And again, that can come from being a sole proprietor, an independent contractor, but you just need to have, be able to show self-employment income. The third requirement is that you have to have your principal place of residence be in the United States. And then lastly, and this is the trickiest one where I think we're just going to try to work through what we know, the last requirement is that you have to have filed or intend to file an IRS Form 1040 Schedule C, which is the federal tax form that a lot of sole proprietorships use to show their income and expenses. So that's the Schedule C, but it also applies to Schedule F, which for our audience, would be most farmers or ranchers who are filing their federal taxes. So I think the key with this is it also can be if you intend to file it. So even if you have not filed a 2019 Schedule F, but you intend to, these rules would apply. And it appears that what SBA is trying to understand is the wages that employment and self-employment taxes are paid on. That's how they're determining the eligibility, which is why we believe they're relying on these tax forms. And so there was an interim final rule that came out in the Federal Register, and in our guide we provide a lot of details and examples on how what specific lines of the forms they use to figure out eligibility. So there's a lot of details there, but like I said, those are specific to the Schedule C or the Schedule F for farmers and ranchers. And so the question becomes, what happens to self-employed people who do not file their federal taxes? And the short answer is that we don't necessarily know. What I can say, and this is a crucial part, I think, for those of you watching, is that part of the rules say that if you cannot show profit on your Schedule C or your Schedule F, if you have no profit, you are not eligible for the PPP. And so that could potentially mean that there are many farmers and ranchers who wouldn't be eligible for this particular program. So that's something, something to keep in mind. So that's the kind of overarching PPP program. The deadline to apply for this program is June 30th of this year. But as I mentioned before, the first round of funding was already exhausted, and I would expect that at some point the second round of funding will also be. So I think it is in everyone's best interest, if this is something where you feel like you might be eligible for, to not wait too long. So that's the PPP. I don't know if Janie or Colby, if you have anything you want to add to that before I move on to the EIDL. Otherwise,
Colby, do you want to add something?
Oh, go ahead, Janie.
One thing I wanted to add, and I may sound like a broken record here, but I've been going on about records for 35 years. This is one of those instances when it's really helpful to have records. Over the years, it's been allowable in many programs to, even if you don't file a Schedule C or an F, to show the equivalent of that in your own business records. I don't believe, Lindsay, that we know that that's going to be acceptable in this program. And part of that, I think, stems from the reality that we're dealing with SBA as opposed to USDA. And they historically have not worked so well in agricultural arenas, particularly with individual farmers and ranchers. So I think, Lindsay, unless Colby or Stephen or somebody tells me to be quiet, it's one of those areas where we're going to have to just see how this opens up and see how stringent they are in terms of requiring a Schedule C or F. That opening of intent to file could actually help us, but at the end of the day, I would imagine that they're going to do some follow-up analysis to see who actually followed through with filing. So I think you've got to be very careful if you walk into that space that you actually do follow through and file either a C or an F. An F is likely more familiar, if you will, to farmers and ranchers. Clearly, it's used by a lot of folks that I know in Indian country, but not everybody. So I think, thank you, Lindsay, for laying this stuff out, but I think we're going to have to keep having some advocacy around some of these issues for sure, for all farmers and ranchers. I hope you agree. So anyway, just records are really important. Your business records are critical at this moment. Who knew this was going to happen? But this is yet another example of how important it is to get some records rolling in your operation. And I think for those folks on the call that advise and work with farmers and ranchers, the more you stress that point, the better, in my opinion.
Okay, thanks, Janie. Colby, anything else, or?
The only thing I would add quickly, and just agreeing with everything that Janie said, is, if you are going to do this or advising someone to be able to do this and apply, I mean, I think what we see, if anything, we've learned from what SBA has done, and I think agencies have done, is that these are all kind of ad hoc processes that are developing currently. So while you may not have some of the particular records that fit in there, if you have something that does match it or come close to build into it, to make the decision if that's going to be something that's worth it to put your time in, because that may either say, oh, okay, we didn't think about that as being eligible, so yes, we will include that in our next round of guidances or next round of approvals. So I wouldn't do too much limiting. I would just try to be able to ensure that if you feel like you're eligible for this program, you have enough material to apply for it, to go ahead and apply for it, and let SBA make that determination and decision, and then go from there, as they may not know what they don't know to make the decisions.
Yeah. And Lindsay, before we move back to you, there's a question here that literally is speaking right to this issue. And I thought we should maybe entertain it right now. Do you think they will let you add back in the depreciation from Schedule F to show a profit versus loss?
Ooh, that is a good question. The only guidance that we have received, and I'll let Stephen might have some thoughts on this too in a second, came out actually from the Treasury Department, where they described now allowing Schedule F. And so it might take going back through that to see if they addressed it. I don't believe they have. But Stephen, are you aware of anything?
No, my sense is that they want to go with the bottom line of the Schedule F, and that number that gets inserted into the 1040 is the one that counts. I mean, they might end up being flexible about it, but right now that's what they think they want, is my take. And we will, of course, look at it again. But I think it's like just exactly that Schedule F number, or C if you didn't do Schedule F.
The other thing I wanted to share with everybody on the call is, and I'm sorry I'm inserting myself. One of the things we have on our radar at NAAF is to actually work with some ag tax folks and do a lot more in-depth work around ag tax issues for tribes. There's only been one guide that was updated once by IEC, and that literally is all that's really kind of out there. And thank them for doing that for sure, because it's a complex area. But this is on our radar, and we're actually probably going to talk about it in a webinar that we have later this week with the Center for Farm Financial Management, because they've got ag tax people on their staff. So this is a time for everybody to raise impossible questions and give us, further indicators of what we need to, go down the rabbit hole and try to figure out, and pull in as many folks that are working in this space as possible. And that's our intention.
Okay, great. Well, I think that we'll have that be what we wrap up for the PPP for now. If you have other questions that arise, please put them into the chat and we'll try to address them later. But I think right now I'm going to move on to talking about the second large SBA program that was rolled out in the CARES Act, the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. And unlike PPP, this program existed in some form previously, so it's not an entirely new concept. EIDL loans under the SBA have been around for years, and they come into play when there's a natural disaster. So these were loans to help people who had lost revenue after natural disasters. And what the CARES Act did is it modified and expanded this program. It modified it in the sense that instead of only being eligible for an EIDL if there's a natural disaster, it expressly added in COVID-19 as a cause or a trigger to get access to these loans. The second thing that the CARES Act EIDL program does is it provides for what are called emergency grants. And so there's the loan aspect and the grant aspect. The loans under the EIDL, they can be up to $2 million. They are loans that are not forgivable. So unlike the PPP, where if you follow all their rules, in theory, you could get 100% of that loan forgiven. With the EIDL, it is more of a traditional loan in that you are paying interest. It's relatively low interest. It's 3.75% or 2.75 if you are a nonprofit, and that's over a 30-year period. And so you've got this kind of traditional loan part of the EIDL program, and then you have these emergency grants. And what these are, this is money, it can be up to $10,000, and it is money that it's a grant. So if you receive $10,000 or any portion of that, you don't have to pay it back. And one of the really important things, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, the EIDL loans have historically not been available to most farmers and ranchers. And that was true under the CARES Act when this COVID-19 version was rolled out. Agricultural enterprises were excluded. So in the first wave of funding, most farmers and ranchers, there were a few exceptions, but most farmers and ranchers could not apply for this program. But that has since changed. When additional money was put in at the end of April, that act expressly said that agricultural enterprises are now eligible. And that term is defined under the law, and it's quite broad. So I'm just going to read it just to so everyone is aware of who this now applies to. So under the EIDL program, agricultural enterprises include those small business concerns engaged in the production of food and fiber, ranching, and raising of livestock, aquaculture, and all other farming and agricultural related industries. So it is very broad, and I just want to emphasize the point that if you had heard that farmers and ranchers are not eligible, that is no longer the case. So now, what are the other eligibility requirements? So again, this is a program designed for small businesses. So it would be farms and ranches with fewer than 500 employees. And for our purposes, that is probably most of the folks that we are working with. So you need to be a small farm or ranch, and you have to have been in business on January 31st of this year. So a slightly different date than with the PPP. So under 500 in business on January 31st. And then these loans are really designed for people who have experienced what the law calls a substantial economic injury in response to COVID-19, excuse me. So that can mean, a substantial economic injury can mean one of three things. So either you have been unable to meet any obligations or payment debts as they have come due, or you've been unable to pay your ordinary and necessary operating expenses because of COVID-19. Or finally, this could come into play if you have been unable to market, produce, or provide a product or service that you normally market, produce, or provide. So those are kind of the circumstances in which you would be eligible for an EIDL. And probably the most important thing for us to know right now is that this program, when it rolled out the second time with the additional money, and when it said, okay, now agricultural enterprises are eligible, for the first couple of weeks after that, SBA was not accepting new applications. Their website said, if you were in the pipeline before, and again, that would be folks who were not farmers and ranchers, because in the first round you were excluded. But if you were in the pipeline and had applied for an EIDL initially, we're going to go through those on a first come, first serve and see how much money we have left, essentially. But that has changed as of yesterday. So yesterday, SBA stated that they are now reopening for new EIDL applicants, but only agricultural enterprises. So right now, there is this window for new applicants and only farmers and ranchers to apply. And again, as I emphasized with the PPP, I think we don't know how quickly this money will go, but it does appear that it is going. And so it's important to get your records in order, as Janie mentioned, and apply if you think you might be eligible. And then I think the last thing I wanted to say about this that might sway people one way or another, even though this program has the two prongs, there's the loan and the grant, and when you apply for a loan, you can also request the emergency grant. You can receive that grant even if ultimately SBA says you don't qualify for the loan. So, you know, there is, in theory, real money in this program, and the requirements to receive the loan are not necessarily the same to receive the grant. So just to make that clear. So that's the overall picture of the EIDL. I know the final thought I will say on these two programs is there have been some questions about, well, can I apply for both a PPP and an EIDL? And the answer to that is yes, you can absolutely apply to both. There is one caveat. As I mentioned before, the PPP funds are used mostly for payroll expenses. The EIDL loans also have, you know, specified uses, and one of those is payroll. So to the extent that you apply for both and want to use money from each of those for the same purpose, so for example, for payroll expenses, SBA is going to deduct what you get back from the PPP, so the reimbursable part of that or the forgivable part of that loan. So you won't be able to double dip for the same uses. So you can absolutely apply for both, and if you used PPP to pay payroll costs and you used your EIDL for rent or utilities or other kind of operating expenses, that is just fine. So I think that is what I wanted to say on that part. And Janie, Colby, pipe in if there's anything else you want to add.
I just wanted to add that this table of contents that I think Alicia has on the screen, we'll make that available to folks so that they have the links to the application. That's all I wanted to add.
So let's move on. If anything, Colby, anything to wrap up on SBA?
No, nothing else to add.
Sounds like a no. Good. All right, let's shift gears for a second and talk about unemployment insurance. This is a little bit of a head scratcher if you've never heard of it before. But essentially what's happened is that Congress has said that if you are self-employed during the pandemic and you can't work when you're self-employed, that means you can qualify for unemployment. And so, you know, a lot of what Congress did with unemployment that got publicity was that they extended the period. You can collect from 26 to 39 weeks. They added another $600 a week to the payments, you know, and that's all important stuff. But one of the interesting things they did, though, was to create this avenue where you can collect unemployment if you're self-employed. And they borrowed this from disaster unemployment. There's a similar kind of program for if there's a natural disaster like fires or floods. And it's a little bit confusing, and it's not going to make anybody whole for what they lost, but it could be a help. So let's just talk about it for a few seconds. Essentially, what happens with this program is that the Department of Labor, the US Department of Labor, creates a set of rules. And then the unemployment offices throughout the country implement it. So for most people, that means a state unemployment office. I mean, I tried to figure out if there are any tribes that run their own unemployment insurance, and I'm thinking no, but I would, of course, love to be corrected if I'm wrong. So I think we're now talking about even Native producers dealing with a state unemployment office. So the states, for their part, may or may not understand that unemployment insurance can include farmers. So we've got a little bit of an uphill struggle here to get people to be able to use this program. But our experience in doing disaster stuff is that you can eventually convince the state to operate the program as it's intended to operate. They're just unfamiliar that, you know, it sounds strange to them too, that you could be a farmer and unemployed. So we have one task. We need to make sure the states are willing to do it, which I think is doable. The second thing, though, is we need to give farmers and ranchers the knowledge to know that it's possible they can apply and participate. And so that's kind of our job to get the word out. There's a nice link on this outline to a Department of Labor site called Find Your Unemployment Office. And it actually does work. You can sort of track down where you might go to collect your unemployment. So how does this actually work in practice? Essentially, what you have to be able to say is that you're self-employed, that is to say you're a farmer or a rancher, and you can't work because of COVID-19. And some of this stuff would be pretty narrow, but important. Like, let's say you're sick, you have the virus, or you're a caregiver for somebody who is, or you're in quarantine. All those are reasons you can't work and should be able to trigger unemployment insurance. The other thing that's sort of interesting is that the Department of Labor says that if you are unable to continue work because, even though if you're self-employed, because you can't go do it, and that you're going to be eligible too. And the example they give are these ride sharing services. So they're saying that those folks who usually cart you around, in charge, they're self-employed, those people can get unemployment. And my sense is that if you go into one of these offices, you can be able to say, hey, my farmer's market got shut down, I qualify for this unemployment. Or I used to sell to a school, the school is shut down, I no longer have a market, therefore I'm unable to farm or ranch, therefore I should qualify for unemployment. Now I've got to say to you that the Department of Labor regulations don't say this exactly. This is something where we would need to try and need to push, but I think it's written so that farmers and ranchers can qualify. I don't think it's what anybody necessarily intended, but the rules are the rules. So if you have experience working with this or you end up having troubles, we would love to hear from you, and we would love to try to help you negotiate and deal with the statewide labor departments that run the unemployment program. Comments or thoughts, Janie? Anybody?
Yeah, I just wanted to let you know that well, all you have to do is look at the Ag Census data to realize how many folks who own and run their own farms and ranches actually work off farm and ranch. So this is likely to come into play more than we think. And I used to run the Oklahoma Department of Labor's unemployment office and handle all of the appeals. And that's a whole nother question that is raised by this whole area, Stephen, is there an appeals process for denial of coverage and all those sorts of things that could kick in on the unemployment side. So again, this is one of those areas that is being built as we go. and historically, farmers have not been able to even access unemployment comp. And so this is a unique situation. And I just think we'll have to keep in touch with each other, try to find things that are happening. If y'all report it back out to us, then we can, run things down. But that's really all I would add right now, is that it is unique. And given the level of off-farm income, I think we should anticipate a lot of farmers actually taking advantage of this, really. And I didn't say at the beginning, I want to say now, when we say farmers or farmers and ranchers, we're really talking about that as broadly as we can think of. But again, if you're a fisher and you're trying to use these resources and you're getting pushed back on that, you need to let us know, because it's very interesting. A lot of these things are coming through SBA, but they don't have the history of working in food and agriculture and aquaculture and all of those things like other departments do. So we're just going to keep our eye on it, Stephen.
Great, thanks. Forward. Roman numeral 7 here is a mouthful. Foreclosure, moratorium, and forbearance. So what we have here is when Congress passed their big COVID-19 CARES Act, they included a little paragraph in there that stopped foreclosures for a certain period and required lenders for people who have borrowed to buy their home what's technically known as forbearance. So let's work through this just for a second and see how it may be of some help to farmers. So essentially here's what this did. It said if you have what they're calling a federally backed residential mortgage, you might be eligible. So federally backed means either the federal government made the loan or guaranteed it. So FHA loans, VA loans, HUD loans, USDA rural housing loans, all of those qualify. Or if you got a mortgage for your home and it got sold eventually to Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, the process we don't need to talk about, then it's also a federally backed mortgage. So roughly we're talking about 2/3 of the mortgages in the country. If you have one of those mortgages, they cannot foreclose on you for 2 months beginning on March 18th. And so that's going to run out in mid-May. If Congress takes this up again, it would be nice if they said, hey, the crisis is not over, maybe we should extend that, but that will be up to them. The other thing that they do in this act, which is maybe more powerful, is what's known as forbearance. So basically, forbearance means that you don't have to make your monthly payments on your home mortgage if you have financial hardship due to COVID-19. And really, I mean, I don't want to quite, make it sound too loose, but you just have to sort of say that that's what happened. You need to kind of explain it, but there's not some big investigation about your circumstances. So for 180 days and possibility of renewal for another 180, you would not have to pay on your home mortgage. Now, it doesn't mean that debt goes away. It just means you don't have to pay. They're not going to charge you any extra fees. They can't. You just get a break, and then you pick up on it later, and you're still going to owe that money. But at least if you can't pay the mortgage right now, that helps you. So the interesting question that we came to was, well, now that's a powerful thing. What if your residential mortgage is also your farm? And so we dug into this, and what we figured out was that all the agencies that are doing this, no matter how it's written, they think it only applies to houses or other homes, and not if you have farmland as a part of the deal. So weirdly, that means that if you have a residence that's part of a farm mortgage, you don't get protected by this, but down the road there could be somebody who has a USDA rural housing loan and is also farming, but they are protected. So some people who farm are going to benefit from this, a lot will not. We thought it was an interesting angle and tried to push it as far as we could get it to go for the benefit of farmers, and that's kind of where we ended up. Any other comments, folks, about foreclosure, moratorium, and forbearance?
Colby, do you want to mention the thing Zach Duchesneau at IC and you kind of ran to ground and are raising up as a possibility that USDA should consider? Oh, you're muted.
Can you all hear me now?
Yeah.
I switched to my phone. It's having some audio issues. So some of the stuff that we've been kind of working on and helping out the Intertribal Agriculture Council and Zach Duchesneau as part of some of the solutions that are being put forward for any of the next rounds of the legislation is really looking at some of the components of kind of lowering payments and doing loan principal deferral. So to keep it very brief, and we're glad to provide some of the documents that we put together for folks for this. And it's basically a three-prong approach that allows the Secretary of Ag to immediately defer all FSA loan principal that's due for 2020 and 2021 production years, and then extend those loans out 2 years, appropriate funding, or allow the Secretary to defer payments to lenders if those lenders reduce the interest rate of their current loans by 2%, and then offer that same reduced loan payment to their borrowers. And then the third is to use the FSA's farm ownership loan to ability to be able to refinance real estate and other debt to aid in recovery from this crisis. And so kind of just the quick talking point bullet of this is that this doesn't really cost any more money by deferring this, and it keeps money in the pocket of producers right now. So whereas Congress has taken a lot of money and put it out onto the street and is continuing to look to do so, and rightfully so, trying to come up with additional solutions to protect people now. So by keeping money in people's pockets, you're able to continue to infuse that into your rural economies, local economies. And as folks know, healthy economies see dollars cycle in them 4 to 6 times. In tribal economies, a lot of times dollars cycle through once, maybe twice. With tribal businesses being closed, that's going to slow that down. Tribal governments having folks furloughed, that slows that down. So keeping money in Indian country and in the pockets of folks to be able to keep production going and to be able to keep people working is incredibly important. So this is just kind of the tenets of what the proposal is for that.
Thanks, Colby. Why don't we move on to what's number 8 on our list? And this is, we just called it regulatory guidance for lending institutions. And a couple of these remaining points kind of arise from this concern that we have, and that is that for farmers and ranchers, we're about to face a credit crunch. If we're going to have a nasty recession, lenders are going to be very shy about lending money. People are not going to be able to make payments. Therefore, it's going to affect their ability to get credit. Just the whole thing can sort of grind to a halt for people, many people who desperately need credit to make a living farming and ranching. So we try to pay close attention to things that would help to loosen things up for credit. And one of the interesting things we found is the regulations that govern lenders. And so the lenders that lend to agriculture, they're so varied. Some are super big and powerful, like Wells Fargo, that you don't really have much sympathy for. Some are very small institutions in your own community that everybody kind of roots for. But what is true for all of them is that they are heavily regulated by the federal government. And one of the things that the federal government will get after a lender for is having a lot of bad loans or losing money on loans. So what these regulators have said in a number of sort of guidance documents is that they also see this credit crunch coming, and they want lenders to know that when they evaluate the lenders, if the lenders take action to help people that are in trouble due to the COVID-19 crisis, they will look on this as a good thing, not a bad thing. And the language is actually pretty good. It talks about how they should consider deferrals, they should waive fees, you should extend terms, delay payments, make small dollar loans for people that are in desperate need for living money, do workouts where you might write down the loans or stretch it out, that you would modify the terms of loans for small businesses and small farms. This would be very significant stuff if lenders felt like they could do it and would do it. And so it may be in a small community institution, you could sort of show them this guidance and say, hey, your regulator is not going to crack down on you the way you might have thought. And then maybe with the sort of big institutions that are always tempted to cut off ag entirely or don't want to lend in Indian country, you can sort of make the point to them that your regulators say that you should be working with us and you should be making these loans. And so we wrote about this and tried to flesh it out as much as we could. That's sort of where we ended up. One of the really interesting things this guidance says is that the Community Reinvestment Act, which old timers may remember, is sort of is a law which says that if you're going to operate in a community, you need to lend there, you need to actually serve it. And one of the things this guidance says is that you will get credit on the Community Reinvestment Act evaluation if you take some of these actions going forward. So, Jeannie, do you have anything to add, or Colby, about the way this would be specifically applicable in Indian country?
Colby, you want to take that one?
Sure. So I think that the point that Stephen made about the CRA is really important. As folks who do follow it know that the CRA, they came out with a new rule earlier this year. I think it was finalized or released. But it does include some very specific components which are positive for investing in Indian country, particularly really clarifying that specific types of activities that spur investment in any country count towards the CRA. Also, even though CRAs do draw their assessment areas of where they do serve, banks do get CRA credit for serving Indian country, even when Indian country may not be specifically included within that assessment area. And also, banks do get a multiplier score for serving Indian country as well too. So there are some things that you may be able to have some of the banks that do fall under this be part of it as well too. You know, some of the work that we've done with the Native American Finance Officers Association and FOA at this time, they've talked specifically about looking at if you're going to be going for some of the different things under the SBA, particularly for the PPP loans, you know, looking to try to look towards Native American banks, seeing where they're chartered as they can be partners with that. Also looking at Native CDFIs, and just for a resource for folks, there is a pretty good map put out by the Center for Indian Country Economic Development at the Minneapolis Fed that has a map of where some of those banks are as well too.
Great. Just a few more things to quickly discuss here. You'll see at number 9 what we called USDA administrative response. And so this is really for people that either are already sort of in the USDA world or are interested in maybe getting a loan from them or participating in other programs. And so what this is basically about is what has USDA done to help make things easier for people that they can do without Congress changing the law. And there are some things. One is, you may remember that people had to really work hard to get the Department of Agriculture to issue a receipt for service every time somebody walked in there. And they've agreed to do it. It's a part of the Farm Bill. And in reality, that's hard to do now that nobody's meeting in offices. They're all doing it by phone. And so one of the things that USDA says is that they will continue to issue these receipt for services, which we as lawyers encourage you to make sure you get. They're a good point to just confirm what went on. But what the USDA says now is that if you talk to them by phone, which is the way you're mainly going to communicate with them, they will issue these receipt for services based on those phone conversations. And so it should go in your file and your records. You know, it's just a part of trying to make sure everybody who deals with folks is being fair and straightforward, and that's what that does. Other questions involved that USDA has acted on is if you already have a direct loan or guaranteed loan. The FSA has said that if you already have a loan, that they're going to extend a few deadlines if you have some problems, and they're also not going to go forward with any foreclosures, at least for now. If you have a guaranteed loan, you're mainly dealing with the bank or the lender, and USDA is telling these lenders that they need to work with borrowers. And I think sort of as a policy matter, it's great if we can emphasize to these lenders and to USDA that the guaranteed lenders have a lot of flexibility in dealing with farmers that are in trouble, and we need to encourage them to use it. And they're not always their first option or first thing they think about. You know, they just need some encouragement, and USDA can do it, and so can we. The last thing I would say is really to sort of emphasize the interesting work that Colby and others have done with IAC, for example, in trying to get USDA to be even more flexible. That stuff is ongoing. Some of it may need to go through Congress, but some of it not. And so as you no doubt will be looking at future editions of the Farmer's Guide to COVID-19 Relief, we will keep you updated there. Just a couple more quick things. Number 10 is crop insurance. And anything anyone wants to add to 9? I'm sorry to jump fast. Okay. Crop insurance is really an important thing if you can use it and if it can make sense for your operation. You know, maybe it's just worth remembering 2/3 of all the cost of crop insurance comes from the federal government. If you can make it apply to your operation is a great thing because there is a very significant subsidy of it. That said, COVID-19 is not an insurable loss. You know, it's what crop insurance mainly does is say your crop didn't go, therefore you're going to get an indemnity, and people's crops are going, and that, you know, that's not the problem. It's other problems. You have a few policies that look at what your income is from your crops. For those, COVID-19 will matter, but that's not most of them. The thing that I really want to emphasize, though, is that if you have a crop insurance policy or you have a NAAF policy from USDA, which is sort of similar to crop insurance, where crop insurance is not available, it may completely make sense because you lost a market for you to change your operation, grow X and not Y, because you lost your market for Y. I mean, any sane person would do that. The problem is that if you have crop insurance, you've already signed a contract that said, I'm going to grow X. And if you just don't do it and don't tell them, you very likely have lost your insurance. So what the crucial thing here is you have to communicate with, they call them AIPs, the people you bought your crop insurance from. It's not USDA, it's the insurance provider. You need to tell them what's going on. Hey, I lost my market for my peppers. Can I do something else instead? Or what am I going to do with my peppers? Just talk to them. And I just, again, this is the lawyer coming forward. When you have these discussions with your crop insurance provider, documentation is great. An email is great. If you are having a phone conversation, write your notes down. This is true in general, but with something like this, where just little conversations can be so important, I really especially encourage you with crop insurance and NAAF. Anything to add, Colby, Janie?
I did want to add something, Stephen. It actually applies to what you were just talking about, but it also applies up above on loan servicing. Please, if you get any letter from USDA about existing loans, do not put it in your sun visor. You've got to read it. You've got to respond to it. You've got to stay on top of it. Just that, I always try to say that no matter what, but it's really important, I think, Stephen, to say it now too, because just stay on top of that. Don't be afraid to open the envelopes, reach out and get some help to interpret if you start getting letters that seem like they're loan servicing letters.
Right. I mean, I think that it cannot be emphasized enough that a lot of things have shut down, but not everything. And one of the things that has not shut down is that if you owe money and you don't pay or can't pay, it's not like nobody notices. So if it's USDA, they will send you what they call a loan servicing packet. As Janie just said, it is really important to read it, respond to it. Please don't just let it sit there. And actually that fits into our point number 11 here too, where we say that state, local, and tribal courts, you know, their hours may have changed. They may be doing some things differently, but they're in action. And I guess that's good in some ways. Where it's dangerous for farmers and ranchers is that means that you're going to get notices about your defaults. People are going to seek judgments. People are going to do all the things that happen when you can't pay your loan. And you have, please open your mail and pay attention to it. The other thing that we sort of briefly mentioned here is that there will be state, local, and tribal programs. And the main thing they're likely to try to do is help people who are homeowners, you know, slow down repossessions of homes and vehicles and things like that. And that's going to be important for farmers because farmers are in more debt than most other people. So, you know, it's useful to sort of stay on top of what these courts are doing and what the state, tribal, and local programs are. We have 3 quick things left. Scams. In the entire time that I've been working with struggling family farmers, and that's a while, The scams never stop. There's always somebody trying to rip off a farmer or a rancher. Now, I think in particular, you're going to be seeing people saying, oh, we can get rid of your debt if you just sign up. Or if you just give us $500, there's a lawsuit where we're going to like do who knows what. You know, the saying, if it sounds too good to be true, it is right. And just check people out. You know, it's so tempting to get sucked in by one of these. These people are good at this stuff. So we really have to protect ourselves, and we have to protect the people that we work with. I want to emphasize on number 13 that I hope I'm not going to hurt anybody's feelings by saying that lenders and institutions, including the United States Department of Agriculture, have had a history of not treating everyone fairly. And that discrimination has led to lawsuits and a lot of other activity. I will just say, for this purpose, it's not only wrong, it's illegal. You know, not all farmers are white men, and if you pretend like or act like the only legitimate farmers are non-native white men, that's wrong. It's illegal, and I hope that we don't tolerate it, and I hope we do everything we can to combat it. The last thing that I wanted to say, and this is actually quite an important point, is that we have an emergency going on here, and the government is doing something. Good for them. They're spending a lot of money, but the rules are often confusing and vague, and we need to make sure that there is a way that ensures that everybody gets a fair shake, that, you know, where there's an appeal system possible, we make sure it works. Where there's a possible accountability, we push, because in the big hurry to get all this money out the door, it may not be that smaller scale producers, that native producers get the same fair shake as they should, and that's kind of what we're here to get after and prevent. Janie, I know you had some thoughts.
Yeah, and I just wanted to reiterate that, Stephen. You know, one of the lessons we learned back in the 80s, Stephen, was that we had to be talking to each other all the time. And one of the other lessons I learned back then was that some of the best advocates for farmers and ranchers were farmers and ranchers, were people who dug into guides like this and, you know, sat in on every webinar and really tried to understand the granularity of some of these things. To me, the best advocate for farmers and ranchers in Indian country are the farmers and ranchers, but also the organizations that work directly with them or are trying to, you know, ramp up more work with them. And we just got to keep each other in the loop. And sometimes you all are going to feel like that NAAF is putting way too much stuff on our website and, you know, and you may feel inundated. Just, you know, throw your hand up and make sure that we can walk you through any weird, complex issue. And if we feel like we can't do it, we're going to pick Stephen up and put him on the phone call with us, you know, and Lindsay and Alicia too, and Colby. At times like this, it really takes all of us, in my opinion. And we got to hang together, and we got to start talking more with each other. We've got to make sure that we got the next generation of native farm and ranch and fishers advocates that are standing up in our midst, and that we don't do this just by screaming from the rooftops. I will tell you, y'all, we have to get in the weeds and understand how these programs work, how our people can take advantage of them and be benefited by them. But when we see things go wrong, we've got to actually pull together and try to fix it. And I know no better, you know, way to really kind of close this webinar out today. If everybody else wants to say anything, they certainly should. But I'm very thankful for this partnership that led to today's webinar. And we're not done. We're going to keep hanging together because we need to. So I'll just leave it with thank you very much, you all. This has been incredibly valuable information. I'm thankful for it. But let's just keep these conversations going so that we can continue to respond. My feeling is that this is not the end. We're going to see additional acts that try to provide relief. And in all likelihood, you guys, we're going to actually shift to then economic recovery acts that are going to feel different than this. And so just strap yourselves in, because we're going to have a lot of things to talk about over the days, weeks, months, and years as we all pull out of this COVID situation. We had one question on the thing though. That I think Carly watched the 60-minute session. We had a question about that.
Yeah, so I'll pick up here. So we have one question. I'll read it out so everybody can hear. Can someone please talk about the 60 minutes piece on relief for farmers that did not get to small farms? How will this affect coronavirus relief for tribal farmers? I'll just set the stage of the episode. My father, who's on the phone right now, told me I had to watch it. It came out Sunday, so I did, because I listened. And then I'll let all the folks chime in who have more experience with this. So it was Leslie Stahl, and she interviewed two farmers from the Dakotas, actually leaders of farm unions from South Dakota and North Dakota, talking about trade war impacts to their operations. So all of you are familiar that we've been in a long trade war with China. There has been something called Market Facilitation Program. Those are payments, and Secretary Perdue described them in the 60 minutes. They don't make people whole, but they try to keep you afloat so that we keep farmers for when the trade war is over. So it talked to those farmers about how that had worked for them or not worked for them. And then Leslie Stahl was able to sit down with Secretary Perdue and talk about market facilitation program payments. And there was a focus particularly on 1/3 of payments going to the top 4% of agricultural producers. And then they interviewed a lawyer from Arkansas about ways that you can set up your farm legal entity in accordance with the rules of accessing payments. So I hope that's a good overview, and now I'll let the panelists jump in and address these questions, particularly relief not getting to small farms, or how will this affect coronavirus relief for tribal farmers?
You know, I'm going to take a first stab at it, because I think Carly did a pretty good job of teeing it up. You know, those programs were actually put in place to address trade problems, right? And a lot of people may not know it, but when I worked at USDA in my first 2 years there, I ran a trade adjustment assistance program for farmers and fishermen. And it was meant to actually provide resources, financial resources, and assistance in modifying your business plans in adjustment to trade. That was to deal with the trade issues that were back then. That was probably 10, 12 years ago, or maybe more. And this particular conversation that happened in 60 minutes was talking about the most recent version of trade reaction and trade assistance programs, in my opinion. But you know, I don't know of any prohibition on actually receiving those funds through that market, you know, assistance program versus anything that's happening out of the CARES Act or that would come up later. I think we'd have to obviously keep an eye on what comes next in any bills and see if there are problems that shut people off if they've already received earlier relief. But you know, the purpose and intention of those particular programs that were put in place to assist farmers and ranchers that were affected by trade really sit around the trade issue. They don't sit around COVID relief issues, in my opinion. But I will tell you, I did want to mention that, you know, that program that was several years ago really actually had a pretty good tool involved in it. It was a tool that put literally, at that time it was $12,500 in people's pockets. But it also provided them technical assistance to actually redo their business plan. And I think it may have been Stephen maybe or Lindsay that mentioned how important it is to really kind of re-examine your business plan, right? At this moment. If you've had a significant disruption and you're taking, advantage of all these programs that are rolling out, you should be looking at your business plan. You really need to be re-examining whether it is appropriate for the world now or whether you need to, flip on a dime and do something slightly different, in which case it's likely going to impact your business plan as you thought it was, right? Carla, I think your dad is actually flipping on a dime right now. He's got new opportunities he's being able to take advantage of. So sometimes these things are not necessarily negative. Sometimes they put in motion some new opportunities.
I mean, maybe one thing to add is that for a lot of the producers in this country, they are very well connected to USDA. USDA knows who they are. There's a sort of a complete mechanism set up for payments to be made efficiently and quickly. But then there's a lot of farm work out there, farmers that are not connected to USDA. And if you're not now, and you want to participate in this CFAP program, as it's called, it takes work. And, there are people out there that, folks that just are not interested, fair enough. But if you are interested, it is, we don't know all the rules for sure yet, but it's going to take getting involved with the USDA office, having good records, and being able to sort of show a loss. And that's just the reality. And so back to the question, it's like, it is uphill. I mean, the system is set up. I mean, I'm sorry to say it this way, the system is set up for the money to go to large operators. That's who's very well prepared to do all this. For the people that we care about, it's harder. It's just harder. And that's why we have a task ahead of us. Colby, I know you had something to add too.
Sure. I think, between you, Janie, this is exactly it. And I think if you look at how the funding is structured in the CARES Act, I mean, they specifically set aside $9.5 billion in disaster for fruit and vegetable farmers, dairy, livestock, local producers that have been shorted receiving emergency assistance. So I think there's a little bit of an understanding that sometimes the payments and how they're structured and how you may present to USDA, or you don't currently work with USDA, or maybe you don't largely get in the queue, can have some of that component, or some of those other issues. So I think that kind of highlights it too, even though, as Janie said, that the Trade Adjustment Act assistance and the trade assistance recently are a little bit differently structured in how they were done. I think going forward, that with the interest that there was, particularly in the CFAP program, and some of the stuff that I think that we've heard from the Hill, is that they are hopeful for those types of programs. But I think just even looking at CARES Act, they recognize that the larger structure doesn't always hit everybody. I know that's something that a lot of tribes and tribal producers have been talking to USDA about for sure, but also talking to the Hill about and saying these programs can't bypass this, because if you put these into the larger infrastructures that already exist, that are already made, without looking at the smaller folks, you're going to skip over places. And that includes Indian country, that includes rural America, that includes places that are hyper rural, where there will be producers who are producing food, but have lost the markets that they've had. So I think if you're starting to look and having these conversations, they're starting to turn towards that, as I think we're hopefully moving away from the idea of throwing quick cash at a problem in an existing system to making direct, specific investments in how the system needs to work for everybody. If this is something that could potentially be experienced down the road, or we could have periods of this, we can't assemble Congress every 4 or 5 months to throw $2 trillion at a problem. it just won't happen. We'll go broke, and it won't be useful, and it won't get to the people who need it most. So I think that having these types of solutions that are focused on ensuring the money gets there is there. So I think the point is important that comes out of that larger discussion. So I would encourage folks to keep collecting the information and data to show what is working, what doesn't work, as those examples are important now more than ever.
Yeah, and I want to mention and pick up on what Colby just said. You know, over half of all producers in Indian country are in the livestock arena, and COVID really is another disaster all on its own. But there's some other controls that are happening in the packing, arena. We got a livestock sector that basically is has a stranglehold on most cow-calf, producers, and we gotta, this is not going to be fixed by the COVID relief that is coming out of Congress right now. It really speaks to what Colby was just saying about food systems that work for everyone. And, there may be some pieces, Lindsay, of the COVID relief stuff that could help folks that are, just getting in a world of hurt around control of the markets, right, on the livestock side, but I don't believe it to be the fix that we need, sadly.
Thank you for that discussion. I have a question that came in via text from a young cattle farmer on the East Coast. The question is, he ramped up his operations significantly for 2020. So he has Schedule F for 2019 and has economic records, but he doubled his herd size right before this happened. And so do you have any advice on how to best characterize the operation in order to show loss? Because we know that there will be market loss. The value of these animals has decreased significantly since purchased, but how do you really characterize if you're in a state of flux when last year really doesn't compare to this year?
That's a really good question, and I'll kind of chime in first, and then anyone else can feel free. I think the key, what I would say first is the guidance that has come out is pretty specific on how you use the Schedule F or the Schedule C to show your eligibility for the Paycheck Protection Program. So the first thing I would say, and in our guide, and we can maybe get a link to this particular person as well, but to read that Treasury guidance, that because it shows examples, so it walks you through step by step. Use this line from Schedule F, and this will get to this number. And so I think the first thing is to go through that process and see where you end up. And if it is not where you think you need to be, then the question becomes, is there another way to demonstrate loss? But the short answer is what we know is what they've told us, and they have told us a specific way to use those farms. And I'm not sure, as we mentioned earlier, if they will allow any substitutions or any sort of reality checks on what's actually happening, and does that allow you to get the relief? So the first thing I would say is to check that guidance. But I don't know, Stephen or anyone else, if there's anything you would add.
I mean, that's one SBA program. The weird thing with all this is that the right hand never knows what the left hand is doing, and they have different requirements. Down the road, we're going to have a CFAP program, to keep using the acronyms, from USDA. They're going to have a big pot of money that's going to go to producers. You're going to have to show a loss, and that's going to be a different ball game entirely. And we don't know what Schedule F will even mean there. And so I think part of the answer for that is stay tuned.
Thank you. We also had a question about a webinar that Janie mentioned. So thank you for tuning into this one. If you'd like to join us again tomorrow, you're welcome to. It's called the Native Farmer Rancher Fisher Sovereignty Series, and it's about accessing data to drive your operation. It's in partnership with the Center for farm financial management out of University of Minnesota. Janie speaks really highly of them, and they have lots of information to share. Also in partnership with the Native CDFI Network and Muskogee Loan Fund with NAAF. So the series started last week. It will be every Wednesday for 6 weeks, and you can find information on our website. If you go to nativeamericanagriculturefund.org and go to resources, you'll see financial tools, and you can sign up there and see what the schedule is for the rest of the series. We'll also send an email after this webinar is over to all those who participated. Thank you so much. We'll attach the document that you've seen on the screen the whole time with the links that work, and we'll put information about upcoming webinars there. And if I may, I just want to reiterate what we started with. Thank you for your time. We understand that you're under immense stress, and that we as a nation are facing something that we haven't before, a world really. I hope that you will know that we care about you. Just like I care about my father and my brother, there are people out there who care about you, and if you reach out, people will listen and come alongside you. Things may not be the same, they likely won't, but we can get through this. We're resilient and we'll make it.
Well said, Carly. So I think unless there's some other questions, then we'll just, we're going to archive this and put it on everybody's website, and the guide's available already on the FLAG's website. And is it on I'm sure it's on Farm Aid's website too. We're going to keep doing webinars. It feels like we do like 4 a day, but we're going to keep doing them. And so we're going to keep adding to the resources. I'm sure when some of these new provisions come out from USDA, we'll be back here again, going through them all. And I really can't thank Colby and Alicia, Lindsay, and Stephen enough. All 3 of their organizations have been invaluable in preparing us for this webinar. And again, this is my full-on endorsement continuing for the rest of my life of FLAG materials because they are like lifesavers. You like put it under your bed, under your pillow at night because they're so deep and thorough. And we got to have people like you guys out there doing that kind of work for all of us because it's really, really important. So with that, I'm going to sign off, and unless there's other questions, then everybody else should offer up their exits, and then we can come back on a future day. Stephen?
Good luck, everybody. A pleasure to participate.
Lindsay?
I'll just say thank you to everyone, and a reminder that feel free to reach out and ask questions or let us know if you're having problems or struggles with any of these programs, and we'll do what we can. So thank you.
Alicia?
Yeah, same. I mean, the Farm Aid hotline is open, and it's really important that we are hearing how things are rolling out on the ground. And all of you are critical to making sure things roll out the way they need to, or that new things are created that do better.
Colby?
Just thank you so much to Farm Aid and FLAG for all the outreach and work that you all have done so far throughout all of this and throughout all the different times as well. And thank you so much to Janie and Carly and your team at NAAF for all the work that you all are doing. We're glad to be able to work with everybody on this and together as we can to be able to support Indian country agriculture through this and to come out of it stronger in the end.
So Carly, I think you and I've said our piece, other than to make sure everybody on this call knows they've got to talk to each other and they've got to keep communicating with all of us. And we're all going to keep on top of this and keep pushing information out to everybody. Stay in touch with your technical specialists with IEC. I always throw them out there too, because man, they're very helpful on the ground. And so there's just a lot of team players out there, and let's just keep it going. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everybody.